Let us begin with the prayer of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, which he wrote for the University of St. Thomas at its founding. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, who desirest that all men should come to the knowledge of the truth, and to this end did enlighten the world with the wonderful learning of St. Thomas Aquinas, mercifully grant that this university, dedicated to his name, may be a seat of wisdom to the young, a mother of good counsel to the community, a blessing to all its benefactors. And as thy eternal truth did become flesh and dwell amongst us, so may that same truth become action in all thy students, that they may think the things that are right, and under thy merciful guidance perform the same through Christ our Lord. Amen. I'm delighted to have you here this evening for the sixth and final presentation in this year's Lenten Lecture Series, hosted by the University of St. Thomas Theology Department. Our first presentation this evening, I thought, was on Father Ciszek, but I just learned it's pronounced Ciszek. Okay. Our speaker will be Carlos Esparza, a Jesuit who is currently doing his regency at Strake Jesuit. Carlos grew up in Dallas, where he attended Jesuit College Preparatory School. In 1998, he entered Harvard, where he worked on his bachelor's in computer science, which he received cum laude. During the summers, he worked in Washington, D.C. for the Department of Defense, helping to map and analyze computer networks. While there, he received merit awards for superior performance to the mission, and also received a National Security Agency Stokes Scholarship, which helped or did pay for his undergraduate degree. In 2006, he moved to Fordham University in New York, in Brooklyn. While there, he helped in campus ministry. He led weekly faith formation for a small group, a Christian life community. During this time, he also taught mathematics at Mount Carmel Middle School, and in 2008 received his Master of Arts in Philosophical Resources from Fordham, where he was also elected to Phi Kappa Phi. In 2009, he received a master's degree in statistics from Columbia University, and later that year came to Houston and has been teaching at Strake Jesuit College Preparatory ever since, where he teaches courses in mathematics. Carlos wrote to me recently this statement. When I first thought about being a priest, it was the Jesuits that taught me in Dallas who inspired me to enter the Jesuits. I also came to know Jesuits in my studies in Boston and my work in Washington, D.C. Having grown up in Dallas, he remains a faithful fan of the Dallas Cowboys, but we're going to let him talk to us anyway. Okay? Carlos.
Well, thank you very much for those remarks, Dr. Hahn. So today I was asked to speak about a Jesuit priest, Walter Ciszek, whose currently cause for canonization is being investigated. Father Ciszek was a Jesuit for, I believe, about 65 years. He was supposed to go to a Boy Scout camp or day fair in about a town maybe 30 miles away. He took a train there. His father gave him money and for the train on the way home and for his food. but instead he spent it on games, he spent all this money, and instead of taking the train home, he had no more money, so he just hitched a ride on the back of a car and rode all the way on the back home. So he was that type of kid. He was never really doing what he was supposed to do. And so for that reason, his parents never really thought that he was the type to want to be a priest. So it was never a sense for him. He never gave out the idea that he was a holy religious child. So when he told his parents that he wanted to be a priest, his father was like, "Not you. You're a bully. You're a kid. You know, what are you talking about? I've never seen these people." But as he states to himself, that he was a stubborn child, and he was very stubborn about it, and that he was determined that he was going to be a priest. So he entered a Polish minor seminary in Michigan, and that's where he stayed for the next few years. He came to know the Jesuits for the first time in that seminary, which was a diocesan seminary, so it had no religious order affiliation there. And a Jesuit came and preached a retreat, and that was the first time he really came to know the Jesuits. And it was there that he came to the notion about what it is for it to be a Jesuit. And the biggest thing that he focused on and reflected on was the vow of obedience. And for him, again, he was an independent, independent-minded person, and for him, that vow of obedience just kind of took him aback. He would not want to do that. But it just kept staying with him. Even though it gave him such a hard time to swallow, that's what he thought, maybe I should be a Jesuit because it gives me such a hard time. So it's that stubbornness again, or that determinedness that comes out to say, hey, I'm going to be able to beat this myself. So I should be a Jesuit so I can do this vow of obedience. And therefore, I'll be able to be, a great Jesuit. He also came to know the Jesuits through reading a biography of a Polish saint who's also a Jesuit, Saint Stanislaus Kostka, who I think kind of reminded him of himself. Saint Stanislaus was a young Polish boy of a noble family who did his studies, high school studies or college studies in Austria, Vienna, Austria. And at one point he decided he wanted to be a Jesuit. His parents were against it, and the Jesuits in Vienna said, we're not going to accept you the Jesuit bishop because we're not going to cause a stir with a very rich family and for you to become a priest. So he decided he was going to walk all the way to Germany by foot to meet another Jesuit, Peter Canisius saint. And there Peter Canisius had him for a while, then St. Stanislaus finally walked from Germany to be received into the order by St. Francis Borgia in Rome. So this Polish saint walked several thousands of miles in Europe by foot. And so I think Father Ciszek, at the time, this young seminarian, thought that maybe I can do the same thing. So he decided, on a whim, that he was going to go from Michigan to New York to Fordham, to the provincial office there, where the provincial offices from the New York province resided, to go see the provincial, the superior of the Jesuits of that province. And he was going to tell him, I want to be a Jesuit. It never occurred to him at that time that this trip would be fruitless, that maybe the provincial says you're crazy, or just stay where you're at. So he actually went to go see the provincial, talked to the provincial, and the provincial says, well, why don't you come back, we'll talk again. And eventually, it went well, and he entered the Jesuits in 1928. So again, that sense of mission came to him as to be a Jesuit. And it was in the first year of his novitiate that there was a call from Rome, from the Pope, that said that he wanted the Jesuits especially to be missioned or to volunteer to be missioned into Russia, because at that time there was a lot of priests were being imprisoned. There was not enough for the faithful, and that the Russian people were really hurting in terms of spiritual needs. So as his first year novice, he decided that he was going to volunteer for this mission. So again, he had these great dreams, big aspirations, and so he went to his novice master and said, I volunteer to go to Russia. And of course, all novices have holy desires, and those are the time they fade away. But for him, he stayed, and he wrote a letter to the Father General as a novice, and surprisingly, his offer himself was accepted by the Father General. He says, I accept you into the Russian mission, but for right now, you need to be a novice, you need to finish your philosophy studies, and at a later time, I will call you to come do your studies in Rome so that you can be sent to Russia eventually. So, he has a lawful desires. He has offered himself, and he finally goes into philosophy studies. In the philosophy studies, he finally gets the notice that he's going to be sent to Rome to study at the Rusikum, which is the Russian center where priests were trained in Russian and the Eastern Rite, so that they can go and be missionaries to Russia. He studied there for a few years, and he was ordained in 1937, which happens to actually be the 400th anniversary of St. Ignatius Loyola's ordination. But at the time, the situation in Russia was tenuous, and because of that, the Pope could not send him to Rome to serve those people there. So instead, he sent him to Albertin, Poland. And that was his first mission after being ordained a priest. While he was in Poland in 1937, or 1938, a year later, Poland was invaded by Germany, and also on the Eastern Front by Russia. Because of this, it caused a great scene. He was able to serve freely in Poland. He had to travel to Lvov, and that was there when he decided, with another priest, that he was going to go into Russia finally. He'd been restricted to Poland for the last 2 years, and finally he said they were going to make an effort with the approval of his Jesuit superior and the approval of the local archbishop. He received his approval, and as such, they made plans to go into Russia in the springtime of 1940. And so for him, he felt it was kind of providential that he didn't go into Russia necessarily, but Russia came to him when the Russian troops came also into Poland. In order to get into Russia, he was going to pose as a worker with Father Makar, and they were going to be laborers traveling by train, and so he had to take on an alias because he would not be able to go in there as a priest. So he took on the alias Vladimir Lipinski, and his backstory was that he was a widower whose family was lost in an air raid the previous year. Based on that, they got on the train and made the long trek into Russia. He worked for a few months, finally, up in Chusovoy in the Ural Mountains, but in June 1940, he was staying with a lady and her son. He taught her son English in the daytime, when the free time, and he also had mass supplies. In the middle of the night, their house was raided, and the Russian police, said that he had cryptic notes that were actually spy messages. Also, the wine was some sort of bomb-making material, and because of that, they arrested him. And those were the charges against him, that he was actually a German spy trying to take down the Russian establishment. However, it became apparent as soon as he got into interrogations that the Russians already knew who he was. His alias did not fool anyone. They knew that he was an American priest, and furthermore, that his name was Walter Ciszek. He later came to find out that one of his early companions was also arrested before he even got into Russia, and he gave out all the information about the party that went before them. So, he was taken at first to several local prisons, but eventually he was finally transferred into the state prison of Lubianca, which is very famous for all the years that he kept spies, accused spies, and the treatment there. He was there for several years, in which he was into a small cell of a room. This prison used to actually be a former hotel, and at the time it was remade into a prison, and he was in solitary confinement. The cell he had a window, but the window did not let any daylight in because on the outside of the prison there was a tin covering blocking everything, so he did not see daylight for some time. Unless he was being transferred to another prison, he never got to see the outside. All during this time, A lot of these details are in his famous biographical book called With God in Russia that was printed in 1964 upon his return to America. He details his daily routine, which consisted of him, the daily meals he had, which was like a piece of bread, hot water, some soup. This is over for a course of a full 24 hours. He would also was not allowed, there was a bed in his room, but he was not allowed to lay down during the day. He always had to be standing or walking around his room. He could not rest. So during that time, he found this was appropriate for him to continue with his spiritual training that he learned as a Jesuit, as a priest. He would do his morning prayer, morning offering. He would do his daily examens, and he would also do other general daily prayer, meditations. He would also, even though he did not have the materials for the Mass, he would recite the Mass prayers from memory. So he would have a spiritual communion every day. And he would do this, and this is kind of what kept him sane, his reliance on God. So, that being said, as I say, he was accused of spying for the Germans, but then he was accused of spying for the Vatican. So at first, they realized that the charge on being a German spy wouldn't stick, but once they knew he was a priest, they thought that the Vatican had put him in Russia to do subversive activities. So he had endured several interrogations by KGB officials, which they would not take no for an answer. He resisted several of them. Then finally, after being drugged, after being kept up for several hours, after being threatened with his life, he finally signed a rigged confession admitting that he was a Vatican spy, all of which are lies. And this was a spiritual low point for him. I wanted to read a selection from his other book, which was done 9 years after the first one, He Leadeth Me, which talks about his own interior movements that happened to him when he was in Russia. The first book he wrote, as I said, was With God in Russia, which talks about the events. This is a book he always wanted to write when he came back, but he didn't have enough time when he first got back. But he wanted to actually talk about the spiritual movements from within, because he thought this would be very helpful to those who read it. And so I read a couple of things to highlight how important a chapter this was in his life, signing this interrogation. As I signed the pages, largely without reading them, I began to burn with shame and guilt. I was totally broken, totally humiliated. It was a moment of agony I'll never forget as long as I live. I was full of fear and yet tormented by conscience. After signing the first 100 pages, I stopped even the pretense of reading the rest. I just wanted to finish signing them as quickly as possible and get out of the interrogator's office. And so he goes and begins, why was he feeling this shame? Why was he feeling this pang of conscience? Slowly, reluctantly, under the gentle proddings of grace, I faced the truth that was at the root of my problem and my shame. The answer was a single word: I. I was ashamed because I knew in my heart that I had tried to do too much on my own and I had failed. I felt guilty because I realized finally that I had asked for God's help, but I really believed in my own ability to avoid evil and to meet every challenge. So he came to the realization that in that prison, doing those daily meditations each day, him resisting the interrogator, that he was relying too much on himself, his own abilities. As I said, he was a stubborn child. He was a stubborn individual as he was growing up, as a Jesuit, how he knew for sure that he was going to Russia. Immediately, he had these holy desires, but at the same time, very determined. And at the same time, he realizes this is also a weakness. And so he also gives some advice for us. He says, "It is an awful thing, this dross of self that spoils even the best things we do out of the supposedly highest motives. Like gold in the furnace, he tried them," says the Book of Wisdom about the souls of the just. Somehow, by the trials and tribulations of this life, our souls must be purified of the dross of self if we are to become ultimately acceptable to God. For each of us, the trials will come in different ways and at different times. But we were created to do God's will and not our own, to make our own wills conform to his and not vice versa. So this is the message he came back, was total abandonment to God's will. And that's, in this book, what he's trying to relate to us in its own way. Well, after he signed the papers of the writ confession, he was convicted and sentenced for 15 years to hard labor in the Gulags, which is in Siberia. So, he started off in Moscow, if you see on the far left there. He made his way through Krasnoyarsk up to Norilsk. And that journey done by plane would be a few hours. By train took 2 weeks to the first place, and then finally another couple weeks up to Norilsk. In Norilsk, he was confined to above the Arctic Circle, which is a dreary place, and he was doing day labor there, whether he was driving a truck, or he was helping in the mines, or he was a logger. He did different types of work in the bitter cold. It was the first time that he was able to say Mass since he was first arrested, which was 4 or 5 years previously. He met a priest there that actually had supplies for Mass, where the local people in the prison would actually bake the bread. He was able to get wine through an external source, and he was able to say Mass in private. Sometimes if he found a place in the forest on a tree stump, he would say Mass. But he relates how such a great joy this was to be able to do this. He was always very careful not to draw the attention of the authorities so that he could not be accused of or be punished in any way. Although they started getting word of this, and so they had to move him from prison to prison and to different places. At the same time, he heard the confessions and tended to spiritual needs of prisoners. It's amazing, I think, that as a young man, as a novice, he wanted to go into Russia to minister to the people. As a young priest, he was arrested as a Vatican spy in Russia, in which he was prevented from doing his ministry. But his sentence of 15 years actually enabled him to actually do the work that he was sent to do there, to actually minister to the people in the prison, to actually hear their confessions, to actually say Mass. Although a lot of them were Orthodox, a lot of them came to see him as a priest that can serve their needs. So he was still able to do the will of God, although it may not be the way that he envisioned it. He finally completed his 15-year sentence in 1955. Upon release, he got freedom, but it wasn't clearly freedom as we know it here. He was restricted to certain areas. He was restricted to only live up in the northern Siberia, Norilsk, and he would not be able to act as a priest in public in any way. He worked in a chemical factory, but it was during this time that he continued his priestly ministry. He would say Mass daily. There was a small chapel in the city that some local families had made for him, which was out at an apartment, and they would get 30 or 40 people crowded in there on Sundays. He would hear confessions. He would travel, baptize people up in the mountains, walk in the rain, the snow, and he always was working. So he worked a regular job as a chemical worker, and then he would also, in his free time, the evenings, on the weekends, he would work as a priest. So he was very much a tired man because of this. He had to keep his job in the chemical factory because if the Russians saw that he had an income that was coming from another source, they would know that he was acting as a priest in a public manner. And the law or the rule in Russia at the time was that no one could receive any stipend or any funds for any religious services. So as long as he said everything was private and that the people came to him to hear the Mass and that he wasn't advertising it, he was, for the most part, staying out of trouble with the authorities. However, this being said, the KGB and the local militia police did not like this one bit. And so eventually he was forced to move again. He was eventually moved, he had to move to another city, and he continued to do the same thing. However, again, it was not an amicable situation. Eventually, once he got out of the prison, though, he was able to write his first letter back to the United States. And he wrote to his sisters in the United States saying that I'm actually alive. He was declared dead in 1947, legally dead. And for this time, at that time, his sisters thought he was dead, his Jesuit brothers thought he was dead, and masses were offered to him. All the Jesuits had to say masses in memoriam for him, for his intentions, for the repose of his soul. And so this was being said. So, at this point, it's ecstatic news that he's alive and that they know he's in Russia. And his sisters played a pivotal role in getting him released from Russia. They notified the American authorities in the State Department, which notified the American Embassy. The American Embassy was trying to get Father Ciszek to apply for an exit visa. Of course, the Russians rejected that. Finally, the sisters, somehow, I don't know why, the Russian authorities actually granted them a visa to come into the country. And they were planning to come see their brother in Moscow. And so he had to get permission to leave Norilsk at the time to be able to go into Moscow. The local officials there would not let him go. But one day they showed up and they said, you need to come with us right now. They took him away, and they took him to Moscow. So he thought he was going to see his sisters because they had been talking in the last few months. They'd been communicating by mail that they were coming at some point. And he thought that this was the time they were coming. So he gets to Moscow, but they don't say anything about his sisters. The KGB agent doesn't say anything to him. But they start showing him Moscow, the city, the cultural sites. They give him a VIP tour of the city. Goes on for 2 or 3 days. And then finally, the KGB official goes, pack everything right now. We need to go to the airport. He gets to the airport. There is an American official there from the embassy. And the American official says, you need to come sign this paper here. Because by signing this, you're saying that you're an American citizen. And at this point, Father Ciszek is ecstatic because he doesn't know what's going on. He signs the paper. There's another American male there who's with him. What was happening was a spy exchange at that time. They were allowed to get on the plane to fly back to America. The exchange had been brokered earlier, and he flew into JFK, in which he was exchanged for a Russian spy, and this happened in 1963. So on the tarmac of JFK, he comes in, his sisters see him, and there's actually an account in With God in Russia by another Jesuit who went there to greet him at the airport, who just displays, this is a man who they had not seen for 30 years, and who they thought was dead as of, for 20 years, and for actually to see him return from the grave, almost as Lazarus, was such a great joy for them. So that was his end of his story from Russia. In his later years, once he returned from the United States, he worked at the John the 23rd Center at Fordham, which is on the picture on the left there, which is located in the Bronx. It's actually now a house for Jesuits who study philosophy at Fordham. I actually lived there for 2 years. In the house, you still have a chapel where he said daily mass. You have a copy of his final vows on the wall. And it's a funny story, and I'll share it with you, an anecdote. But as you come into the house, if you go into the dining hall, the first thing that the Jesuits tell the new philosophers as they come in, oh, that's where Father Ciszek died, which is in the corner of the dining hall by the bread box. And you're like, he died right here at the bread box? Yeah, that's where he died. It used to be his bedroom, but they don't tell you that until later. But what happened was, after he died, within a few days later, the provincial of the New York province says, we have to tear down that room. Because he knew by the devotion people have for him, a cult was going to form, and if that happened, they would not be able to use that space. So they tore down the room, kept the chapel up as a remembrance of him, and so they were able to use the house now as it is for a house for young Jesuit scholastics. He died in 1984, and he's currently buried in Warnersville, Pennsylvania, which is the location of the Jesuit novitiate which he attended, which is just outside of, I think, Allentown. I've actually been there. I actually prayed at his grave. That's actually where I first encountered this book. I read it on retreat there, and it was actually great to be at the place where he was buried and actually be able to ask for intercessions from him at his gravesite. So this is just a quick timeline, so you can put everything back together, showing that in 1904 he was born. In the 20s, he went to a seminary, a minor seminary. Then he entered the Jesuits. And in 1937, he was ordained. He actually was the first American Roman Catholic priest to be ordained to the Byzantine Rite. It was in 1939 that he entered Russia. He's arrested in the early 40s. He signs his confession in 42. In 47, he's declared legally dead in the United States. And he has his freedom in 55. And when he comes back to the United States, that's when he writes his books of With God in Russia. As I said, was the biographical detail of what actually happened there. In 1973, he wrote He Leadeth Me, which is an excellent book, and I recommend those of you who are looking for some spiritual reading is very fruitful. And he died in 1984 in the Bronx. So talking about his cause for canonization, immediately after he died in 84, Mother Marija, the superior of the Byzantine Carmelite monastery, which he helped found, Father Ciszek helped found, started a petition to recognize heroic virtues and holiness. 5 years after his death, the Walter Ciszek Prayer League formed, and right now the cause is currently with the Diocese of Allentown, which is where his birthplace, Shenandoah, resides. He was granted the title of Servant of God in 1990, and the process for canonization began. Postulators gathered information from that time for 16 years, from 1990 on, about his virtue and his heroic values. And finally, February 2006, all accumulated documentation was prepared for shipment to Father Paolo Molinari of the Jesuits, who is the Jesuit Postulator General in Rome, the person who actually promotes all the causes for those who are for sainthood among the Jesuits. And he was going to present it, well, he's presenting the case to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. So once the congregation opens up the documents that they have, that will begin the second phase of the process begins, which they will hear testimony given by witnesses and all the evidence contained actually that were shipped over to Rome. And the next step will be the trial of venerable, and from there, that's when they will look into whether miracles, the necessary miracles for beatification and canonization. There are two postulators for the cause right now. One is a diocesan priest, Monsignor Montone, and the other one's a Jesuit, Father Sable. Can I give you an idea of the documentation? In order to send the documentation over, I got this information actually from their website that they have, ciszek.org, where they had to construct these special crates about, I think, 120 pounds. So very heavy, that would keep the moisture out, and at the same time, allow for electronic surveillance the entire time of putting them together and to delivery. They were always under watch, except during flight. After they were shipped to Rome, the copies were sent to Rome. Other original documents were put under seal in the diocesan office. So they have not been touched yet until Rome gets the final okay. So it's a long process. So we're at the very beginning of it with Father Ciszek, and we'll see where it goes from now. Recently, as of this past fall, the postulator, Father Montone, has said that the work is being done behind the scenes. It's been going well, but nothing officially has come out yet, and they're still waiting to see the next phase can get started soon. So for further reading, these are the books. With God in Russia, as I said, was his biographical book. He Leadeth Me, which is kind of his spiritual diary. And then finally, the website, which details the cause, what's going on right now, some of his biographical details, and other resources, media that you can find is at www.ciszek.org. Thank you very much.